Good evening. Welcome to Township Village Committee of the Whole meeting on May 7th, 2024. Welcome to everybody in the gallery, which seems kind of sparse tonight, and everybody watching on YouTube. I will start with a roll call of council. I, Councillor Schwint, am present and chairing the meeting tonight. Mayor Shantz,
Present. Present.
Present. Present.
and Councillor Grant.
Present.
Thank you. Before we begin, we need to pass a motion to reconvene in open session. Can I get a motion, mover and seconder? Councillor Bryant, Councillor Cadeau, all in favor? That is carried. Moving on to land acknowledgement. I want to acknowledge the land on which we live has been here from time immemorial, and the Indigenous people have lived here from time immemorial. I thank the Shinaatin, also called the Attawandaron, the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee people, who have lived here and cared for this land, and who continue to share and steward the land with us. May we together learn to care for each other, our flora and fauna, and the land that sustains us. Do any council members wish to declare a conflict of interest? Seeing none, there are no items to come forward from closed session, no public meetings tonight, and no presentations. Not seeing any delegations or unfinished business. We're moving quickly on to consent items. For the consent items, we have one item for information and public notice. That the following consent items be received for information, and that is the notice of hearing on June 3rd. I have a mover and a seconder for receiving this information. Councillor Grant, Mayor Shantz, all in favor? We've received that. Staff reports and memos. ERO postings related to various planning regulations from April of this year. Tonight we have Manager of Planning Jeremy Vink and Deputy Director of Finance Richard Petherick here to present the report. Jeremy, do you want to start?
Sure. Thank you, Council. So this is kind of a bunch of ERO postings all put together here because the province put them all out at once. So we're talking the review of the proposed provincial policies, changes to the Development Charges Act, the proposed changes to regulations under the Planning Act, Development Charges Act, Bill 185, cutting the red tape, Building More Homes Act, newspaper notice requirements and consequential housekeeping changes, proposed Planning Act changes, municipal act changes, proposed amendments to Ontario regulations regarding planning data reporting, and proposed regulatory changes to under the Planning Act related to cutting red tape, More Homes Act, removing barriers to additional residential units. So just a few acts that were up in front of us tonight in case anybody was bored and wanted to review them on the ERO pages. Always good planning things in case you want to get a good nap in somewhere. So, so moving through these changes to kind of highlight them to council, to let you know what's happening, what's proposed, and to determine what kind of feedback we want to give to the province on a bunch of these changes. So we're going to start with the proposed provincial policy statement 2024. So this shouldn't be confused with the proposed provincial policy statement 2023 that came out last year that there was a feedback to, that we gave feedback to. They have now given us the revised version for 2024 based on some changes. So that's what's new today for that section. With that, in the new proposed 2024 provincial policy statements, you'll realize there is in the previous one in 2023, they had talked about on farm properties, they were talking about allowing up to three severances. That's now been taken away, and they're kind of back to the old policies as under the current provincial policy statements. So they've eliminated those severance opportunities and went back to the supporting agriculture and not supporting the severances. They have some proposals around settlement boundary expansions. So, so in that section, there's a proposal under the plan that planning authorities would establish and implement phasing policies where appropriate to ensure that development within designated growth areas is orderly and aligns with timely provision of infrastructure and public service facilities. So they're putting that wording into the provincial policy statement. Definitely, we encourage that. That's something the township has always done, and we want to see is that we get to grow orderly in an orderly fashion based on our phasing and what's appropriate to match those growth projections that we'd like to see in Woolwich, tied to our population growth forecasts. So definitely, that's a great policy to actually see being put into place. The other one is that the introduction that people can come in for settlement boundary expansions outside of a full comprehensive review by the municipality. So individuals could come to the township and say, hey, we want you to shift the boundary or create a boundary and put my property into a settlement and create a settlement. So that's done completely outside of a municipal comprehensive review where we've been doing them in the past. And that's the only way you could do them in the last few years is through a municipal comprehensive review, where what the region was doing a few years ago, which led to ROPA 6, is that full-on analysis of what's the growth projections? Where do we see growth? What do we do? Do we do intensification versus greenfield? How much intensification versus how much greenfield? And then based on that, where do we put that amount of growth appropriately? So that made a good sense that we've looked at the big picture holistically as municipalities to make the best decision. This would kind of revert that. It would allow people to come in and knock on your door and basically try open anything up in front of council to make that decision, and then potentially appeal if council didn't support their decision. So it's not encouraged. We don't see that as a good way to comprehensively plan. It just encourages people to come in and try to get their properties into a settlement to see development on their own properties for their own benefit, not necessarily for the benefit of the municipality. So that is something we would not like to encourage. Major transit station areas. So they're just putting in some stuff around major transit station areas in the provincial policy statement. I just want you to highlight that the bare minimum around a major transit station within about 800 meters of a major transit station, they're looking at a density of 150 residents and jobs per hectare. So what that might mean to Woolwich. Just realizing that the GO station would probably be classified as a major transit station because it's a central hub that you would have for GO Transit with Metrolinx there. So that means in and around the GO station, we could potentially be looking at densities of 150 residents per hectare within 800 meters. So that's what we'd have to work with under provincial policy if that came into place. And that's done to encourage people to utilize the transit there that's put in place so that they don't walk, they can walk over to it or et cetera versus owning vehicles. There's some proposals around commercial plaza redevelopment. No major concerns. I'm seeing underutilized plaza to go to better use is a good thing, but we just want to make sure it's done properly. But no major concerns seeing them redeveloped to something better. The newspaper notice requirements. Just as a change here. Now, what they're proposing is because newspapers are starting to disappear and it's harder to find newspapers of general circulation. So under the current provincial guidelines of the Planning Act under for zoning and official plan amendments, et cetera, one of the ways we can send out notice is by putting in the newspaper of general circulation. If that doesn't exist, it becomes harder to meet the requirements for municipalities, especially in some areas where further north or so that it's just, you don't have newspaper whatsoever. So rather than rely on something that may not work for municipalities, they're proposing that we would have the opportunity to be able to post it on a municipal website instead. So these are or options. So you do either notice or this or this. So this was an or option. So it wouldn't take away that you could still do the mailing notice. For our purposes, just in terms of the township, we do multiple things. These are bare minimums. So we go above and beyond the minimums, for example. So the minimums give you flexibility that that's what you have to hit in a municipality, but doesn't stop you from going above and beyond. So we do 150 meters versus 120 meters. We do the newspaper as well as a sign. We do mailings on top of that. So we do a bunch of these things to put everything out, or the webpage. So we got everything going on to make sure we kind of hit our community. And so we have no real concerns here just because we are realizing newspapers are disappearing, and that could impact us too if the Woolwich Observer was to disappear. That's our only newspaper of general circulation. So we want another alternative option. And that would be especially in cases of where we do bigger general amendments for the zoning bylaw and official plan. We're trying to hit the community as a whole, and mailings would be huge and massive and be costly. It would be too costly. Appeal rates. So the province is looking at changing who can appeal applications under the Planning Act for official plans and zoning bylaws. So right now, as you're aware, is people can come and they can present their case, and then if they don't like the decision, they can appeal to the OLT. That could be us as a municipality if Committee of Adjustment made a decision we didn't like. That could be the applicant if they didn't like council's decision, or a neighboring resident if they didn't like the decision of council. So what they're proposing in this case is they would limit who can appeal down to certain bodies, public bodies. So essentially ministry, the region, the GRCA, that kind of thing could appeal. Those would be set up bodies that could still maintain appeal. The applicant can still appeal, but the public wouldn't be allowed to appeal. So the general public, if they didn't feel it was an appropriate decision, would no longer be allowed to go to the OLT. So that's that third party appeal process would be lost. Staff note, this obviously takes away from some community engagement and involvement and really breaks down a bit of that democratic process. It's trying, I think, to get people to get advance and people to come forward at the bigger time at the OP and processes and zoning bylaw general amendment process to get people engaged earlier on rather than at a neighborhood level and reacting at a neighborhood level. But as noted, it's not going to give that local voice to them when they come in front of you as much because the developer will have no incentive. What it does give councils, and staff, is puts us in a bit more of a political hot seat. So essentially, the community is going to rely on us to make sure their voices are heard because you are that last decision. No matter which way this goes, they want to sway you to make sure you go that route. So they're going to be putting a bit of more political pressure on staff and council to kind of vote particularly or solve those issues with the residents issues with the developer first. That may get the developer to be willing to work with us, hopefully, but it's not, like I said, the greatest democratic approach. There is the development charges. I think I'll stop for that a bit later and let Richard come back to the end of the process and I'll finish up the planning process if everyone's okay with that. Okay. So moving on with the Planning Act items. So there are proposed changes to the Planning Act timelines and refunds. So as you're aware, about a year or two ago, the province changed and said, under the Planning Act, you have so many days to deal with an official plan amendment or a zone change or a site plan. And if we didn't meet those timelines, we had to start refunding the applicant. What that caused was great stress to everybody because we were trying to narrow everything down in a very limited timeline that things weren't working as well. The developers didn't enjoy it because they were pressured and they were not getting time to respond back to staff basically with changes and the community felt like we weren't getting time to even deal with it in a timely manner. So by removing this whole refund issue, it's going to give us back to the old process. The timelines will still exist and an applicant could still appeal if council doesn't meet the timelines if they so felt that was a concern. But generally speaking, most developers are saying, no, we want to work with you. Forget the timelines, let's work things out. And if we can work things out, we're not going to appeal. It's only when they don't think they're going to resolve anything that they would look to appeal a non-decision. So this would get us back to the older process where we can work through issues together better and in a more efficient process, especially if we were going to take away that third-party appeal, we want more time. So this is a better idea, I think, all around for everybody, public, council, and the developer, if we get rid of that refund process. Just in terms of that, they're also looking at the pre-application consultation process. So what happened when you couldn't appeal, when we had our timelines to work with things, we were putting in pre-consultation to try to get things in front of council as complete as possible. So the province is saying, forget the pre-consultation process. If you don't want to, submit for complete and go. So they're trying to keep things moving into the planning process rather than being front heavy with potentially pre-consultation. It doesn't mean you don't have to pre-consult or don't want to pre-consult. You can do that. They're just saying people wouldn't necessarily have to be required to do pre-consultation. And that would then, interestingly, bring the whole process back in front of the public because there'd be no pre-consultation prior to it coming to the council. Upper tier planning authority. So as you were aware, a few years ago, the province announced that they'd be removing upper tier planning approval authorities from most of the regions across the province. So they have now chosen to eliminate the upper tier planning approval authority for Peel, Halton, and York as of July 1st, 2024. So that's coming up in just over a month and a half or so away. They made it clearly in their note, they're saying the elimination of the same for Waterloo, Region, Durham, Niagara, and Simcoe will be done by the end of the year. So the timeline is coming where we will be taking on full municipal planning authority and the region's authority might be lost by the end of the year. The use it or lose it, as they're calling it, process under the Planning Act is basically saying municipalities, when we allocate subdivisions and we give allocation of servicing, they're saying to developers, either you use it, or if you're not seeming to be using your allocation after a few years, the municipality can revoke it and give it to someone who's ready to go and willing to develop. Essentially saying, either you develop or we find someone who's going to develop and put the housing up that we want. So nothing wrong with that process, to be honest, because we don't want someone sitting on a critical infrastructure services that aren't being utilized when we have someone else ready to develop. The accessory dwelling unit regulations are looking at those and eliminating barriers to maximum lot coverage and limits on bedrooms allowed per lot. So they'd be looking at lifting that, and they're talking about more urban areas. So they're talking where your full municipal services are in place. So those types of areas, so where we're talking about, in our cases, would be Elmira, St. Jacobs, and Breslau, where full municipal services are available. They're not looking at the rural areas or private serviced areas. They're talking full serviced, where everything's there available. So that's only the areas that they'd be looking at making those changes. Just from a municipal perspective, to in context for that, as you remember, we did the zoning bylaw a few weeks ago. In the new zoning bylaw in the urban areas, for the most part of Elmira, St. Jacobs, and Breslau, we changed a lot of the zoning in many of our residential zones to allow a variety of housing options. So not only can someone have in a single detached dwelling with ADUs, accessory dwelling units, some of them can be converted to, people can do triplexes, dwelling conversions, duplexes, things like that. So we were allowing a mix of housing types already and going for that, and giving flexibility for different types of housing units on parcels in Elmira, St. Jacobs, and Breslau. So going 3 or more in many cases, there's only a few spots that we left at the single duplex area. There's not many. So just to note, that change wouldn't really do much from our zoning bylaw perspective. Wouldn't give them much more flexibility. Community facilities is one of the next sections the province is talking about, and community facilities is things like schools and areas, things like that run by major, obviously school boards or municipal operations would be exempt from site plan. So although that's proposed, the township would prefer they didn't take them away from site plan. We've had questions and concerns about operating schools with how they just function in terms of drop-offs, make sure there's spots on site for drop-offs and parking and bus movements, just how they're going to operate in general, because that becomes very critical in these neighborhoods. And we've had a lot of concerns from residents in that respect. So we wouldn't want to move away from the site plan process because we want to work with the school boards to make sure the sites work well in our neighborhoods. So we do not recommend that they exempt the community facilities from site plan process. The major transit station areas parking. So because we're doing various different acts and many different things are being changed, we're back to this one again, the major transit areas, which we go areas. So that 800 meters again, and around a GO station, for example, they're saying that the developer wouldn't have to provide minimum parking. They would determine what parking they need, not our zoning bylaw, and they would provide the parking they determine is appropriate. So that's what they're proposing, is that the developer would determine the amount of parking that would be provided within that area of the major transit station, whatever set residential development they're proposing. And then lastly, the next act, which they're talking about, they just proposed some questions to municipalities and the public, basically around the accessory residential units. And they have 2 questions here. They are saying, are there specific zoning bylaw barriers or standards or requirements that frustrate developers of ARUs, building height, maximum lot size, side and rear lot setbacks, lot coverage, bedrooms, etc., that are concerning? Or are there any other changes that would help support development of ARUs? And they're just asking those questions broadly to determine, I guess, which route they might want to go in the future to make changes at the provincial level. So that's the essential context of all the planning changes. It's I know a lot of them and a bunch of different pieces moving through, because like I said, there's about 6 postings on the ERO that we kind of went through with the different changes that are happening. If you can make heads or tails of some of it, I'm happy, because it's not easy for anyone. So it keeps us on our toes. So that's it for the planning side. I think the development charges side, we can turn to Mr. Petherick and then maybe open it up to the floor for questions. If that's fine with the chair, or do you want to do questions on the
I'm
planning
wondering if we
side?
should do questions on the planning now while we're still fresh
Whichever
in
you
our
prefer.
minds.
Whichever you prefer.
What's the will of council? Councilor Cadola?
Thanks, Chair. A lot of work went into this and it's obvious from the report, so thank you for that. I think that one thing that I continue to come back to is the major transit and some of the density around it. You're talking about the GO station in Breslau. Is it gonna be like the sole one within Woolwich that we're going to have to build around? Like, is it gonna be the sole transit station that we see this density around that's not really in accordance with the rest of the community? And that's kind of what I worry about.
Through the chair, yeah, excellent question. Will it be the only one forever? I don't know. The next possibility would be the stockyards. If they were to bring the ion up and stop it at the stockyards, it might meet the term for a major transit. But the stockyards is a bit of a different entity because there's no residential in the stockyards, it's employment. So that you wouldn't have that same residential component, obviously. Breslau is going to have the residential side in and around a GO station. So long-term, maybe another one. Just to put a bit more context to this too, we're saying 150 is kind of the minimum. The province is stating, because there's some stations that would say 200, 250, but I'm hoping we would be at the lower level. We could ask for an alternative, but is in the wording of the policy at this point that we could ask for an alternative density target. And they do it on a case-by-case basis. The maximum density we allow in our current official plan is 120 units per hectare, which 150 is a bit higher, yes, but no one's hitting 120 for the most part. The closest we are going to get to the 120 right now is actually the Trinity United development in Elmira, which will be over the 120. So just to give some context, there's nothing else on Breslau at that density right now, but it doesn't mean in the future you won't see some higher density in and around Breslau in different areas, and this will just be slightly higher than some of those at this point.
So if I can just follow up on that question, how does the province take into account the parking? I assume they're gonna put in place for the GO station as well. Is that taken out of the area when they're calculating their density?
So to the chair, yeah, the GO station in Breslau is intended to be a kiss and ride, drive to and drop people off or park your vehicle. It's not meant to be like a downtown city one where you wouldn't have much parking. So their plan in the GO station in Breslau was to have parking in and around the GO itself. So that was a requirement that they have, I think, about 200 parking spaces around the GO station itself for the GO users. The way I understand it is the density and the parking is tied to development in and around it on other parcels that you would see higher density of residential, where they would not need to meet our minimums, and they determine what parking requirements they want to set in place for their residential developments nearby, but it is not the GO itself.
Councilor Bryant?
Thank you. Through you to Jeremy. I guess my question's about the third-party appeals. I find that very frustrating, I think, for the residents, because if they're cut out of that whole process, as you said before, there goes our democracy as far as people having the ability to appeal these situations. And then the fallback's going to come to staff and council, which I don't think is a fair way for the government to do this. I think it should be up to the residents to have the right to appeal. Whether or not they win is a different story, but they should have that right. And I think taking that away from them is a big, big problem. And I don't know how we deal with this, but I really think that they need to have that. So somehow we need to make sure that our voices are heard.
Councilor Grant?
Thank you. I also have maybe a question on the appeal rights. Specifically, I think you said that the region could still appeal, but and another one of those was talking about the region may also be removed from the planning process. I'm just wondering how the appeal would work in that case if the region no longer has planning approval. I'm just kind of confused on that dichotomy.
Through the chair to Councilor Grant. So although the region loses planning approval authority. They they would no longer be a regional official plan. They wouldn't be our approval authority for plans of subdivision or condominiums, et cetera. So, and they wouldn't approve our official plan amendments anymore. It doesn't mean the region doesn't have an interest in certain elements. So there would still be interests around servicing, because they provide the major services, like obviously our sanitary, there's some pipes and they run the pumping stations and things like that, treatment plants. They might have comments around that way. They also have regional roads. There might be some jurisdiction around a regional road, for example, they might wish to appeal to. So there's elements there that they still, as a public body, oversee that may be impacted by a planning application where they would see they wish to appeal it. There obviously would be less issues, but there would still have issues that they could appeal from. Same as a school board, for example, could have an issue that they wish to appeal, for example.
I'm wondering too, if that's maybe something we could look at the region as a third-party appeal process for residents, that they could go to the region and voice their concerns as a potential.
Um,
Councillor Burgess, I see your hand.
Through you, Chair. Yeah, I'd agree with Councillor Bryant and the comments she made there, and I think it's something, once this motion's moved, that we can chat about amongst ourselves more and make a motion,
Yeah.
hopefully along those lines. Just two other quick things, if I may. I appreciate for the notice to residents on development projects and that we go over and above these standards. I would like to see that changed for the province as a whole, but I realize it's lots of different situations, and that's not something we can look at right now. But yeah, I appreciate you going 150 meters, doing both the newspapers and online, and letting residents know via mail. And the last thing was, this is maybe a tough question, putting you on the spot here, but the use it or lose it policy. Do you see developers dragging their feet in the current economy trying to get development done, or like houses built? And could you think of anything, other teeth we could have to kind of get people moving? Might be a tough one.
So definitely through the chair to Councillor Burgess. Other teeth to get them moving? No, we don't have a lot of teeth. Once you approve it, you're subject to them doing something, right? Sometimes a frustration of residents because they see an application get approved to the planning level at the township, and 3 years later, the site's still sitting empty, and they're wondering why it's not developed. And they were hoping for something, maybe apartments or whatever. And they're like, well, why isn't it? And we're like, we can't make them develop it. So yeah, the incentive of use it or lose it is a key item in that case, because that's, if they're sitting on something, they know they can develop at any point in time, it has value too. So they can always sell it or do with something in the future. And when they see things work for them, but if they realize they could lose that opportunity, that might be more of an incentive, because you also then, if you try to sell it, for example, or you don't develop yourself and try to sell it, if you don't have the services that go with it, no one's going to want to buy it. So you're trying to taking away value if you don't do something with it. Does it happen that sometimes developments don't proceed in a timely fashion? Yes, that we would like them to be. I would say from what we would like them to be in a timeline. So there are properties out there that I know in Woolwich that haven't developed as quickly as we would like them. They're behind, and that has held up, not necessarily held things up, but it's disappointing because we don't have the growth that we had anticipated. And it does mean that some other developers were held up somewhat in the process because we didn't have the servicing sitting ready for them and staging available to them.
I see Miss Freeze appeared on the screen.
Sorry, I just wanted to add to what Jeremy was saying as well, is although we may not have a tool that, other than that, to make them develop, we are looking at incentives to encourage them to develop. And that's part of the HAF funding, is using some of that HAF money to incentivize rental units. So we have that opportunity as well, that we can try to encourage development to happen faster.
Thank you. Councillor Bryant?
Thank you. Just to follow up with this one, could we possibly put a bylaw in place if they are sitting on properties and not developing them, where they are, I won't say penalized, but they are taxed on empty sites, that may encourage them to do it, or else they'll start paying taxes? It's like having houses sitting empty that, I think it's BC is taxing people on that. Maybe we could go down a path like that. Just a thought.
For the chair, I really don't know that answer. My guess is, because I've never heard anyone do it, that there's probably not something in the municipal act to let us do that. I think the ones that you're talking about, the vacant property taxes, for the like condos and stuff and the cities are doing, they had to get special permissions to go through that. I know Toronto does the same thing, the vacant property tax type thing. So there's special provisions to do that, and it's a bit of administrative work, but I don't know, you'd have to ask probably a good lawyer if we could go that route. Or our finance department may know eventually and research for you, but
That's a good segue. I think.
well, segue, yeah, if you want to segue to Richard and ask.
I think we've had a good conversation on the planning side of things. Mr. Petherick's been very patient. Why don't we give him a chance to talk about the next side of it before we move on to Bo's recommendation. Mr.
Good.
Petherick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So mine will at least to be a little more brief than I think Jeremy's presentation. Really, there's, I would say, two major things that Bill 185 is changing from what actually was changed in Bill 23. So they're kind of reversing course on a couple of things. One of them is allowing growth-related studies to be included back in your background study, so we can start collecting development charges on that. And that is also including our background study can actually be an eligible expense. The other one is, sorry, I actually just lost my train of thought. The other one is with regards to the removing of the mandatory phase-in of DCs. Through Bill 23, they enacted that you would have to phase in your development charges when you had a new development charge bylaw passed, that you can only collect 80% of it, and it would go up increments of 5% from that every year up for 5 years. So they've kind of reversed course on that in Bill 185 and are allowing that mandatory phase-in to be eliminated. That means we can go back to what we currently are doing right now is we will be collecting DCs based on the bylaw that we've actually had passed, and there is no phase-in. The third one is just with regards to under Section 26, there's a freeze. So the way it was currently written before was under the freeze provisions that those that had a complete application for a site plan or a zoning amendment of some kind, this plan of subdivision, could actually have their development charges frozen for a 2-year period. So the date that it was deemed complete, those DCs that were applicable at that time, those are the DCs that would apply to that development. Of course, there would be an interest cost to it, but they'd be frozen at that rate. And they actually had 2 years in order to start pulling permits in order for that to be applicable. So what Bill 185 is proposing is it changes from 24 months down to 18 months, because really essentially what they're doing is they're trying to encourage people to get on with their developments. So those are the major ones. So I'll take any questions if council has any.
Thank you very much, Mr. Petherick. Questions? I think you can get off a little bit easier, Mr. Vink. Not seeing any. I guess we've got a recommendation. Council conversation about this, Councilor Cadeau?
Yeah, through you, Chair. Excuse me. I'm just wondering, Jeremy, if you can speak to whether or not this would be an appropriate forum for us to recommend incentivizing sustainable development to the province. I know that's something that's come up at the council level on a number of occasions. There's nothing that we have at the municipal level, and I don't think, aside from the the building code, and what we had heard in training is kind of the base level of what can be done from a sustainable development point of view. Could we incentivize developers to adopt sustainable practices? Could we encourage the province to take that direction? And would this be an appropriate forum for us to do that?
The chair to Councillor Cadeau, is it a good forum? I suppose they're amending so many different things. It's an opportunity to suggest they incorporate something along those lines in the provincial policy statement to further encourage that or give incentives to us and provide other opportunities. So I wouldn't say it's not an opportunity, because this is the chance to throw things out there because they threw everything at you. So definitely you could add that in and make that suggestion to implement it in the PPS, for example, the policies to support that. And they maybe consider changes to the Planning Act to give us greater power to do that somewhere along somehow.
So if we wanted to go ahead and do that, would that be something that you would want a motion for, or could we give advice to staff to maybe examine that?
Through the chair to Councillor Cadeau. So because we're dealing with ERO postings and they're only up for a month, the reason we're here in front of you tonight is the only thing that you really wanted to talk about is because the ERO postings close mostly at the end of the week. So if we want to give comments, we have to do it this week. So otherwise we're late, and we all know what the province does. Sometimes we don't even get to the end of the commenting process in the past. Sometimes they took things down on us. So if you want to do it now, we have to kind of do it now to get it to them, because staff will be sending this literally off to them tomorrow or Thursday. So I would suggest if you have anything, any comments you want, make the amendments to the recommendation tonight so staff can forward it on to the province and give them those comments under the ERO. That gives you at least that opportunity in the ERO process. Doesn't prevent you from the future coming back with something stronger to your MPP or the province to say, hey, we want you to consider things. You didn't do it in through that process. Is there something else we could do?
I'm happy to put forward a motion to provide feedback to the province to incentivize sustainable development. I don't know if you need anything
Councillor,
beyond that.
just want to make it simple. Could we have a motion to adopt the recommendation and make amendments such as yours as we go along? Does that make sense, Clerk Smith? I'm getting one nod, so I'm gonna ask for a motion on the general recommendation. Councillor Bryant, second, Councillor Burgess. In discussion or amendments, Councillor Cadeau.
I would like to amend to incentivize sustainable development.
So I need a seconder for the amendment. Councillor Bryant, and discussion on the amendment. Mayor Schwartz.
Can we just get the clerk to maybe finesse the wording a little bit? Thanks.
Sorry, Mayor Schwartz.
Yeah, I think, assuming it fits in with, what this, what the government's doing here with the Planning Act, I think it's a good thing to at least ask for, right? And maybe while Jeff is finessing, I would ask staff, is that something that we can do here? Regardless of what the province does?
So through the chair to the mayor. So staff, through different wording in ROP, has given ways to try and incentivize certain developments over others. So when we start trying to weigh things out, we sometimes say we will give maybe allocation or consider some developments in front of others if they're trying to give us things we're looking for, such as affordable housing, things like that. So we're going to rank them higher in terms of seeing their development move forward because they're going to give us things we're looking for. So we're more likely to give them the staging and the servicing if they're giving us things that we are looking for and they're meeting the demands that our wants versus the demands. So we do that through the official plan to kind of make clear these are things that will get you ahead of the curve and put you in the top of our list to be considered, basically.
Is that explicitly outlined in our official plan? And sorry, I don't have it memorized.
Obviously, everybody has memorized, but it is in the official plan that we do give, like, for example, right now, it's to affordable housing, for example. So when we come back with a new official plan, you can remind me at that point in time to make sure it's in there about sustainability or anything else you want to say is incentivizing. So to say that these are things we would like a subdivision to see or development to see come forward with versus beyond the bare minimum, basically.
And that will be as soon as we get final direction from Bill 23. Is that correct? Sometime after that.
Sometime after that other decision from the province that we're waiting for, yes.
Clerk Smith, have you got the wordsmithing to make Councillor Cadeau sound like a genius?
I'll do my best through you, Mr. Chair. Sorry, my camera's off. There we go. So I was thinking that we would recommend that the province consider amending the Planning Act to allow incentivizing sustainable developments.
Councillor Bryant?
I have one that I would like to add in there as well. Do we want to do it separately or do it all at once? Okay.
Oh. Separately. So any more discussion on the sustainable side? Otherwise, I'll call the question on the amendment. All in favor? Oh, that's carried. So we've got amended. More amendments. Councillor Bryant.
Thank you. I would like to have it where we do not eliminate third-party appeals. Sorry. Okay, advise the government of Ontario that the township does not support the proposal to limit third-party appeals. Thank you, Evan.
Assuming that's a motion and a seconder from Councilor Burgess. Discussion on the third-party appeals. Not seeing any, Councilor Burgess.
It's already basically, through you, Chair, it's already basically been said, but yeah, like appreciate that we're reducing red tape, but we don't want to reduce the rights of residents. I think this is an important thing that they have a say. Obviously, council wants to have a say too, and we're not trying to cut back on our authority or us trying to listen to residents, but we're in a democratic country, and I think this needs to be something that people have a right to. We don't want to steamroll these rights just because we want houses built.
Mayor Shots.
Can I just get some clarification on that? Because someone who's directly affected can still appeal in this, if I understand it correctly, scenario. It's just that I can't appeal Bonnie's new shed, right?
So through the chair to council, so a third party is someone external. So it's not the township or the applicant, okay? So it'll be a neighboring resident or something like that, somebody in the area or whatever, somebody who is not the applicant or not the township, obviously, or a public body that's been identified that can still maintain their appeal. So yes, if I was complaining about my neighbor's shed and I wanted to appeal that, I would lose that because that's my neighbor and not my application. So I would not be able to make that appeal.
That's all right.
Thank you. Just to clarify for the mayor, in the case of a gravel pit, you'd have the two, and if a community group wanted to fight it, they would be shut out of the process going forward is what's happening now. That's one example, because I know they're voicing their opinions. They're quite upset over this process that the government's trying to make that change.
I'd like to clarify with staff, is there a requirement now for those association groups to preserve the right to appeal to be involved in the process from an earlier stage, or they come in after the fact?
It's a tricky question, to be honest. That was a good question, but a tricky one. So people can come in once something's appealed, okay? So if a resident appeals something, another party could come in and join the appeal process, for example. So if an individual or a group appeals, somebody else could come in at the same time and say, I also want to join the OLT appeal. So that can happen after the appeal is made. But the person who's appealing, the person or the appeal body or group, like the neighboring group may have come together as a residents association, has to have been involved in the process, or it's likely the OLT will toss them because they're saying, well, you were never involved. So you have no right to come make the appeal. You didn't come in the beginning of the process, so why are you coming now? So there's a strong chance they would never move the appeal forward if you had never been involved in the process. That's basically it.
That's helpful.
Yeah.
Further comments on the amendment? We're all clear, we're preserving the right to appeal. Call the question, all in favor? Opposed? That one's carried. Other comments, questions? I guess I've got one myself on the settlement boundaries. I was really struggling with this because I understand we don't want to be changing settlement boundaries all the time. But when there's minor changes, make a person wait 1, 2, 3, 4 years till the next time is up for review, goes against the grain for me as well. And I think we saw an example last week of a minor 2 lots or something maybe council should be able to look at versus adding 1,000 acres to a minor. It doesn't make sense between periods. So how do you find a middle ground to allow the small person to move on with their plans, whereas a large development can do when they want?
To the chair, it gets tricky, right? Because then you're starting to classify what's big, what's small, how many is too many, too little. So that's why occasionally when we do the official plan review, and which we're doing now, there will be these minor boundary adjustment questions that we're going to look at. And people are putting in their requests, like we heard the other week. The request is in, we'll weigh those requests and council will make those decisions. They don't come often because they are minor boundary adjustments, so we don't often see them because there's not many of them. And in the some 20 odd years, we've done a few minor boundary adjustments to settlements, and they've been here and there, very minor, like, and they're just few and far between to official plan amendments. So I don't think at the end of the day, we're gonna see too many of them that they'd come in to say one or two more that it fits just perfectly, because we've got most of them kind of rounded out properly. It's the question of how many more do you keep adding, and where's the logical extension and where's the logical end? Because what we tend to see, unfortunately, is people trying to push things up along a road, and then you got this very linear development, not anything with depth, for example, or how big is too many? Like, is it 5, 10, 15? And what are the implications? So it gets tricky to draw lines about who gets in and who doesn't. And that's where we do a comprehensive review, say, how much land do we really need to be taken up, and how much do we need to use, and where's the best way to deal with it? Set the policy and use that as the guide is hopefully the goal we're looking for.
So I'm hearing both sides of the argument from you that I heard. We don't have very many of
Yeah.
them, so we don't have them, any of them,
We don't have,
but it's hard to draw the line.
Yeah.
So wondering if council's any direction on this one. Mayor Shantz?
I mean, that was part of the thinking in requesting that the urban boundaries move to the countryside line so that we would have some of that flexibility. I acknowledge that's just the 3 urban centers and not the other settlements, but there's always going to be a line somewhere, right? So, yeah.
The question is, how often we want to look at that? Mr. Vink?
thank you for indulging me. So that's the challenge, is you don't want to do it ad hoc all the time. And that's what we're saying, doing this ad hoc randomly based on an individual's request for their own personal benefit, basically, is probably not the best way to plan something. So if we're going to do planning, the best way to do it is at the OP level, doing it regularly to check and do our alignments and determine what is the appropriate tests and which ones do we want in or out, versus doing an ad hoc that everybody comes in when they want to and makes the argument, because you lose the big picture focus. And because if everybody starts coming in and each settlement, somebody comes in and says, I want 5, 10, 15 lots, by the time you're done around 20 settlements, you've added in 100 lots. Do we want that? Is that the implications we want? So no, we want to do it comprehensively. So what we're saying, the best way to do anything is do it comprehensively, not on one-offs based on an individual landowner's request. And that's where you do it at a good official plan process. And if council deemed at a certain point saying, no, we think there's enough requests, staff should do an official plan review and recrunch the numbers, then it's done comprehensively versus, like I said, one-offs, which is not the best approach, I don't think.
Councilor Kiddo?
Thanks, Chair. Through you, I think that, almost pleading for a bit of a middle ground. Could we set up a system whereby, like, I guess I should start here. How often do we do an official review, like ideally?
We will do generally a review, minor reviews every 5 years. Major reviews will be every 10, 15, 20. It depends how big of concerns there are, but not as regularly, obviously. So we're usually on a 5-year rotation basis. We're taking a look at things and doing minor adjustments.
So could we even move to a system where every 2 years we did like a mini? So then you don't have the ad hoc ones. If somebody comes forward with requests, we say, yeah, we can look at it, but we don't have the next full review until such and such a date. However, we are going to open it up for a review of applications that have come forward in the interim, and we'll see if we can do anything before we reopen the full review. Is that something that other areas have done? Is that something that we could consider?
So through the chair again, Deanne's obviously popped on too, so she has some comments. Just in that regard, it's the 5-year review is put in place because you don't want to keep going back and reviewing your policies all the time. You don't have the staff resources to do that regularly. So generally speaking, I wouldn't say we're going to come up at every so many year basis just because somebody might come in. that's where I'm saying is if there was enough requests, you might direct staff to say, hey, there is a bunch of requests. Maybe we do bump up the 5-year review to a 4-year instead this time around or something. That's where we would look, like I said, more comprehensively, but wouldn't suggest that we ad hocly change a process for that we don't even know how many people are gonna come in the door at this point. So it's a little bit of jumping ahead of the game. I think we should be focused on saying like, do we support this direction or are we just gonna continue through with the official plan process and doing it in a more comprehensive scale? Or do we want people to come in ad hoc is what the province is suggesting. So that's what we're kind of tackling tonight. Depending where that goes, we can determine what we have to do in the future of how we deal with it. Do we deal with ad hoc ones because that's the province set in place, or are we going to deal with that province didn't make changes and we then deal with how we're going to treat them internally through official plan processes, through a comprehensive look?
I think we'll let Ms. Freeze jump in, hoping in her comments she can tell us when the last 2 official plan reviews have been done. So have we met the 5-year target, or what is been past practice?
So yeah, that 5-year question is definitely a question for Jeremy, who's been here a lot longer than I have, but just want to say, it is very difficult to do a review before the 5-year mark. It takes a lot of time, a lot of staff time, and we definitely don't have the resources to start doing additional reviews within that time frame. With a brand new official plan, we hope to not have to do a review for 10 years. So it's not something we want to pick up every 2 years. And then the other point that I just wanted to quickly say is that even if council decides to support this and this policy goes through with the additions to the settlement areas outside of a municipal comprehensive review, there still would be criteria in place that these individuals would have to satisfy. If the province moves ahead with our request for additional lands in Breslau, one of the requirements for any addition to the settlement areas would be need. And we would have a very hard time ever justifying need when we have all those lands added in Breslau. So I'm not trying to change your opinion anyway. I'm just trying to say that that might throw a wrench in it right there, that it would be very hard to find any kind of need if we get those additional lands.
Thank you, Ms. Freeze. And Mr. Vink, do you know when the last couple official plans have been done?
So we're currently in our conformity exercise with the regional official plan and doing a major update. Prior to that, we did do one in 2022. That was to make up for the fact that we hadn't done one for probably about 10 years before that. We missed the 5-year review and probably maybe even a 10-year review. So there was a big gap that happened, unfortunately. And that's just what happened for various reasons. But yeah, so we try to do the 5-year review, and our goal is to try hit on the 5-year review moving forward, not having big gaps of 10 years or more.
Mayor Schatz?
Just a question on that. It's a bit of a rabbit hole, but what was part of the reason that it was delayed because of the OLT, the OMB meetings on the regional official plan?
No, it was delayed for various other reasons. But yeah, we never hit our targets, but we should have. So like, for example, if you look at Wellesley and Wilmot or Waterloo, they wrapped up their official plans years before, did their conformity exercises a few years before ours were done. So we were way behind that, just generally speaking.
So I think to summarize, what I'm hearing is it's a lot of work to go through this process. At the same time, we're aiming for a 5-year review. We're achieving somewhere between 5 and 10 years, and that's a long time, I'm gonna say, for property owner to have to wait. Is there room for middle ground or not? And maybe it's too big a can to open tonight.
If just before council weighs in, if you're struggling, because it seems like one where people don't know where to go, it's not an easy answer one necessarily. But as Director Freeze mentioned, there are criteria outlined in the report that they'd have to meet. So that is the alternative, is that you just say, hey, we'll leave it as is, see what the province does with it. If they leave they leave the criteria in, it sets the boundaries for what someone has to do when they submit, you leave it that way. it's not a free for all completely. It is that they have to come in with they have to meet, what, 6, 7 tests to submit, so.
What's the wish of council?
I'll chime in that I tend to agree with staff position on this. I don't really want the ad hoc ones coming in, so their direction back to the province, I would be in agreement with. I don't think that we would vary it.
Not seeing anybody else jump up on this one. Any other amendments or items for discussion on this recommendation? Okay, I will call the question with the amended version. All in favor? Opposed? That one carried. And I will find my place on the script. We are on to other business. Any counselors or would the mayor like to give a report on any activities? Counselor Cadeau.
We had our inaugural track meeting last week. It went well, with a couple minor hiccups along the way. But I'm excited to be chairing that committee moving forward, and I just wanted to let council know that that did indeed happen.
Thank you, Counselor. Anybody else? Moving on to the outstanding activity list. Any discussion on? Seeing none, there's no notice of motion. And that brings us to the end of the meeting. Could I get a motion to adjourn? Counselor Grant, Counselor Cadeau, all in favor? We are adjourned. In closing, council would like to thank everybody for watching on YouTube tonight and wish you a good night and see you again next week for a council meeting.